Good morning and welcome to ICommunicate. Glad to be back here on a Thursday morning. And wow, it's so funny. The weeks go by and different topics cross my mind. And I have to tell you that I've been doing a lot of thinking on listening. And it's one of those skills that theoretically we're taught in school, right? We're taught at home by our parents, we're taught in school by our teachers. And the way we're typically taught is on demand. So parents will ask us to listen to what they're saying. Teachers will ask us to listen to what they're saying or quiet down or do something to command our attention. And that's how we learn to listen. It's, hey, you need to listen, so now listen. The problem with that is that there's a presumption that when you're actually not saying anything, you're listening. And this show today is dedicated to knowing if you're a good listener, knowing how you can become a better listener, knowing what gets in the way of being a good listener. And as we get started, I want you to think about something. In the phrase I want you to think about, and I'm going to turn it around a little bit, but the phrase I want you to think about is, can I grab your attention? And the reason why I like that phrase is because there's an implied hope, be a verbal or written communication, people are trying to grab our attention. We try to use visual images. We try to use clever or engaging wording. We try to use things like inflection and intonation when we talk to people to capture their attention. But now more than ever, we are in a place in this world where there's so little attention span and there is so much perceived busyness that grabbing one's attention is a tall order. It's never been as hard as it is today to grab someone's attention. But I want you to think of it a little different. Instead of depending on somebody else to grab your attention and hoping that someone else grabs your attention, I want to think about it this way. Can you grab your own attention? Can you stop yourself from being distracted? Can you set yourself up for success by being present and focused on the matter at hand, on the topic at hand, on the person at hand? Can you do that? Can you grab your own attention? Can you stop yourself from being distracted? And can you set yourself up for success? And have you ever thought about it that way? Have you ever thought of you being able to grab your own attention? Now look, there are things in life that we know when it really intrigues us, we pay attention. But even then, I challenge, even when you are truly engaged in paying attention, are you focused and being present so you're not thinking about anything else but the matter at hand? Now, we know that when a coach pulls a team together in sports in a huddle, we see it on TV all the time, there's a presumption that everybody's listening. We know as an adult, when you start a meeting, there's an etiquette and an expectation and a presumption that, hey, it's time to listen. And it's funny, because if I actually kept track over the course of my life, how often I ask someone a question and how often they don't, not only do they not answer the question I'm asking, I'm lucky if they even answer indirectly, never mind directly. And I always say to myself, did you not hear the question I just asked? Now, it's possible that they just didn't understand the question and give them the benefit of the doubt. That's very possible. But I'm telling you, if I had a nickel for every time I asked someone a question and they didn't actually respond by answering the question I was asking, it would be a crazy number. Now, here's the question. How do you really know you're a good listener? Now, there's a lot of people who claim to be good listeners, and I'll say to them, well, how do you assess whether you're a good listener, right? How do you really know, okay? And I'm going to tell you the three most common answers I get when I ask people if they think they're a good listener. And one of the answers is not talking when others speaking, interrupting, not interrupting. Now, you know that. Everybody knows from an etiquette perspective you're not supposed to interrupt. But that's tricky, isn't it? Because not interrupting is not just verbally not interrupting, it's body language not interrupting, right? It's not opening your mouth as if you're willing to say something, because that could interrupt what a person's saying or their thought process. It could be specific body language that you're demonstrating while they're talking that could interrupt what they're saying or their thought process. So we're all told to not interrupt. We know you're not supposed to interrupt, but people interrupt in different ways all the time. The second most common way is, like I was just speaking of, letting people know you're listening through eye contact, nodding, facial expressions, verbal sounds. Well, here's the problem with that. Can you think of a time you've been in a conversation with someone and you've been looking at them in the eye and you're totally thinking about something else? You know, you may be thinking about what you're going to have for dinner tonight. You may be thinking about emails you have to return. You may be thinking about preparing for an upcoming meeting in the afternoon. If you're a kid, it could be playing with your friends. It could be 100 things. So this is what I mean by, we're supposed to think that others are listening to us when they're making eye contact, when they're nodding, when they make verbal sounds. Okay, yep, But what's tricky about this is I used to have a woman work for me years ago. Really nice, hardworking woman. But she just was never succinct. So when she wanted to tell me something or ask me a question, she would go on and on and on. And she would walk in my office. And I would intentionally not making eye contact with her to make it clear that I wasn't listening, and she couldn't pick up those signs at all. And so she would say to me she would tell me a bunch of different information, and I'd be like, okay, and nod my head. And so finally it got to the point when she wasn't picking up any cues. I had to say to her, I said, listen, I'm not going to say her name, but I said, I have to say to her, so-and-so, if I'm not making eye contact with you, if you don't have clarity that I'm definitely listening to you, then either grab my attention or come back a different time. And what's tricky about this is, when you're the receiver of the information, and people don't think of it this way, when you are not fully present, and when you're nodding your head, and when you're making eye contact, and when you're giving those verbal affirmations, you might think you're doing your job by checking off a box of listening, but you know what you're not necessarily thinking of? The giver of the information is expecting you to process this information. And if this is an important conversation that you're going to have to come back and have again because there was details shared and there's follow-up steps, what are you going to say because you weren't fully listening? And they're going to look at you and get frustrated and say, well, I told you that. Don't you remember when we talked about this? And you're not going to remember because you were not fully engaged or present. And then the third thing is reflective listening. Now, I'm a huge fan of reflective listening, and I would say that for those of you who aren't familiar with the term, reflective listening is basically paraphrasing back what you've heard, repeating, not necessarily word for word, because that could come across as condescending. But what's big about reflective listening is it tells the person who's talking they have to be listening because they just reiterated back what I've said and they've clearly understood my point. Or reflective listening provides the benefit that you rephrase back what they said, but you may be wrong, and it gives them an opportunity to correct it so you can gain that understanding and clarity. But look, the bottom line is this. Whether it's not interrupting, whether it's listening through body language, whether it's reflectively listening, these are the common rules people apply. And if they say I do those three things well, then I'm a good listener. To which I would respond, are you able to do those things across the board, no matter what kind of person you're talking to? And when I say what kind of person, I could be talking about if it's in the workplace. I could talk about managing up, down, sideways. It could be a client. It could be a prospect. It could be a vendor, right? So when I say, are you able to be a good listener across the board, consistently, regardless of the person, regardless of the situation? What do I mean by situation? Is there conflict involved? Is there frustration involved? Is there fatigue or hunger involved? The bottom line is, as we get into our second segment, I want you to think about in the break here, what are the situations that you effectively listen the best And what are things you do to set yourself up for success, to be a great listener? Because I can't think of a more important and validating communication skill than listening. Okay, so when we come back from our first break, we're going to get into more of how do you know if people are truly listening, and I'm going to teach you a technique that you can use in your personal, professional career to really once and for all validate whether people are really listening to you and to get that confirmation. ICommunicate, this is Mark Altman. We'll be right back. Okay, welcome back to ICommunicate. This is Mark Altman. I am the founder and head trainer at MindsetGo. And at MindsetGo, we're a company, we're trying to help people become more confident and effective communicators. And a lot of what we do in helping people do that are based on emotional intelligence and generational communication and really being able to execute so many difficult conversations. And there's 5 typical ingredients to being a good listener. And today we're really focusing on the listening ingredient. So let's get to the elephant in the room. How do you truly know if you have someone's attention? Okay? And I want you to think of it this way. If you're trying to envision in your head right now how you know if you have someone's attention, look, when people are asking questions, when people are paraphrasing what you're going to say, when people are taking notes, I mean, there are indications that people may have your attention. But I want you to think of it a little differently. I want you to think about the benefits of processing what you've heard. And what I mean by that is, let's pretend you're working with an employee and giving them a new project or a new task for the first time. Theoretically, you're going over what the project is, what are the different things you want them to accomplish, what the goal of the project is, what the deliverable looks like for the project, and you're basically covering all the details that you think they would need to know, a person would need to know to effectively manage the project. Okay? So the question is, the way conversations typically end is the person giving the instructions. If it's a sports situation, teaching a new play, teaching a new strategy, when the teaching part is over, when the explaining part is over, what do we typically say? Does that make sense? Do you understand what I'm saying? Do you feel prepared to move forward? Which seems like a logical way to end the conversation. However, those endings to the conversation are flawed for a few different reasons. One of them is they're closed-ended questions. So when you ask a closed-ended question to get clarity, to see if people really understood and were able to process what you just explained, the inherent nature would probably be to say yes. Why? Because think about what it would look like if you didn't answer yes. One of the assumptions to the person who has to answer that question is, well, if I say no or I'm not sure, does it look like I wasn't doing a job listening or listening at all? Should I already know this, and does it make me look stupid, or will I be likely to be judged because I am saying I completely understand? And by the way, that's if it's a one-on-one. Can you imagine how that ramps up in a group setting where majority, if not all the other people in the group are acknowledging they understand, and you're going to stick your nose out or neck out and say, no, geez, I don't really understand, sorry. And then you add the element, if you're that person, now you feel guilt because you're holding the group up. So think about those 3 downsides to answering no to the closed-ended question, does this make sense? Do I really understand? So what we're talking about here is a concept and a technique I teach called communication confirmation. How do you really confirm someone understands what to do? And by the way, this does not even get into, even if they understand what to do, they might not even have the tools, experience, or knowledge to be able to execute it. But if they don't understand what to do, then it's a foundational failure. So that's the baseline of what you've got to understand. So, communication confirmation, okay? So let's talk, before I get to the steps and how you can achieve communication confirmation, I want you to think about what the general cycle of communication is, okay? So the cycle starts with you having a thought that you think is important enough to share to someone else. And when you have that thought, theoretically, not only is it important to share to someone else, but you have to think of what's the right time to share it with that person. How much of this should I share with that person? Is this person in a place where they could actually hear what I'm about to say? So the thought and spoken part has some elements that you have to consider, aside from just blurting it out when it's convenient for you and when you're ready to discuss it. So you thought about it, you've considered those criteria, and you've now spoken about it, right? Now, was it heard? And that's what we've been talking about. Was it heard and was it understood? That's the exact point communication and confirmation is all about. Heard and understood. So before I get to the final steps of the communication cycle, let me just summarize. So you've got thought and spoken that go together. You've got heard and understood that go together. And then you've got agreed to, acted on, and implemented. So now the person, you got that communication confirmation, they clearly understand what they're supposed to do, but are they going to agree to carry it forward? Do they have the necessary tools and confidence and knowledge to act on it? And then will they indeed act on it? So those are 7 steps to the communication cycle. And this is why communication skills are so critical, because when you really want to influence people, when you really want to motivate and impact people's lives, you have to take all those 7 components of the communication cycle into consideration. And if you're skipping 1 or 2 of them or missing 1 or 2 of them, even if you do the other 5 or 6 flawlessly, it could still very much interrupt the success of implementing that behavior. Now, when I talk about communication confirmation, this is how I want you to think about it, okay? I want you to think about it in a way that you are in a conversation, and instead of asking those closed-ended questions, like, does that make sense? Do you understand? Whatever, think about an open-ended question you could ask. So if you were teaching someone how to do a specific task or project, and there were 3 critical components, instead of saying, does that make sense? You could say, let me ask you before we finish, I had mentioned A, B, and C were important components of the project. Are any of those specific components a struggle for you, or that we should touch up and cover a little bit more that you may not still fully understand? So the idea is, instead of asking generic closed-ended questions, you're asking very specific questions related to the instructions, the project, the task, the strategy that you covered. Because that way it gives them a chance in that moment to say, well, yeah, you know what, I am still struggling with blank. One of the things about listening and processing information you have to take into consideration is, if you're talking to someone for 15 minutes, okay, think of this radio show, this podcast, listening for an hour, you may love it. You may think it's great. You may tell all your friends about it, but I bet at the end of this hour, you know, you're thinking about so many different components of what was discussed, and the chance that you're going to remember them all. And if I think about it this way, if after you listen to this radio show, I was to say to you, so what did you think of the radio show? You may be a little bit overwhelmed in that moment. You may say it's good. You may cite one thing that you remember, as opposed to, hey, in today's radio show, what was your favorite part when I talked about why it's so hard to listen? What are the factors of being a good listener, or the parts of the communication cycle? Now I've planted some ideas in your head that don't put you on the spot and make it a little easier to respond and formulate their thoughts, as opposed to just coming out with a generic response. So this is really important. So we're back to communication confirmation. So you get the no closed-ended questions. But there's 4 other things that you can do to me to get that communication confirmation, to really nail down that the person or people you were talking about heard what you said and they've really understood what you said. And here they are. Number 1, give people permission to say, I don't know. So many people don't want to be judged. And a lot of times their default reaction is to say, yep, no, it's okay, I got it. Say, listen, if you have questions, it's totally okay. Don't worry about it. It's hard for me to pick up things the first time around. This was a lot of information. Use empathy. Let them know not only is it okay to ask questions, but through empathy, because you know what it's like to be on the other side when you're learning something for the first time. So if you create that environment for safe, open, honest feedback and communication, just by giving permission and letting people know you've been in their shoes, is a great way to motivate people to tell the truth. Another example is, what questions can I answer for you? So what's great about what questions can I answer for you is it implies that it's acceptable to have questions. There's no ambiguity. It's not like, do you have any questions? It is, well, what questions can I answer for you? The third one is, tell me what you heard. Tell me what were the main concepts of what we discussed. Let them regurgitate back some information for you. Okay, and that at least gives you a snapshot, a little bit, of what they might have heard, what they might have processed. Okay, and one of the things that when I'm getting communication confirmation, I really encourage/require people to take notes, because now more than ever, the likelihood you're going to be able to recall everything you heard while fighting through distractions that we talked about earlier in the show. And when you ask them the question, tell me what you heard, if they can actually take the pressure off themselves and look back at their notes. And by the way, one of the great things I confirm how people process information and listening is, look at their notes. See what they actually wrote down. See if they captured the main ideas of what you're talking about. You may be very surprised at how they process information and if they did actually capture the main ideas. And that's just a different way of using reflective listening, because you have a chance to respond to what they did or didn't understand. And lastly, the last thing I'll cover before we go into our next break is nagging rights. And so nagging rights are a lot of times when people don't feel comfortable right in that moment. Think about it this way. Maybe people think they have understood everything you've said because they actually haven't had a time to review their notes, fully digest it, or fully process it. Okay? Nagging rights is twofold. Nagging rights gives you permission as the giver of the information to joke. I call it nagging rights because it's a joking way to say it, to come back to them the next day or two and say, hey, I know it's been a day or so. I just wanted to make sure you still didn't have any questions, or I wanted to figure out what questions you did specifically have. So that gives you a chance to come back. Don't feel like they're being nagged or doubted. And also by giving them nagging rights, that they can come back to you a day or two later and not feel bad if they thought of different questions or new questions that they hadn't originally thought they had when you originally had the discussion. So nagging rights is really twofold. And so those are the aspects of communication confirmation that can really allow you to confirm that heard and understood concept of listening. So we're going to go to break. When we come back, we're going to talk about listening during conflict. For ICommunicate, I'm Mark Altman. We'll be right back. Okay, welcome back to ICommunicate. Glad to have you here with us. And we're talking about listening. And we're taking listening from a different perspective today, talking about grabbing your own attention with listening as opposed to depending on other people to capture your attention so you can stay focused and mindful. So we're going to talk a little bit about listening during conflict. And there are so many situations. That's why when I talked earlier in the show is, how do you really know if you're a good listener? There are so many situations, so many different kinds of relationships you have in life that can impact your ability to listen. And that doesn't even talk about environmental and cultural, and the list goes on and on. But one of my pet peeves about conflict is the role of the victim. And here's what I mean by that. You can be having a disagreement with someone where you feel like someone wronged you, hurt you, disappointed you, frustrated you, did something to wrong you. And in this specific circumstance, both sides would probably agree in a calm moment that what that person did was wrong. But here's what happens with conflict and listening. If the person who feels wronged communicates their hurt, frustration, or disappointment in an angry way, then the focus is taken off the matter at hand, which is why they were upset, and it becomes very focused on the reaction. So no matter how you wrong someone, okay, if you communicate your hurt in an angry way, then the person who did wrong now often becomes the victim. Because now it's two wrongs don't make right. I might have done something to hurt your feelings, but you just yelled at me, or you just spoke disrespectfully to me, or you just insulted or criticized me. So this is an aspect of listening and how we process information. So there's almost a responsibility, and I talk about this a lot in my trainings for MindsetGo. Who's the onus of communication? Is the onus of communication on the person who has been wronged or hurt and disappointed, and how they actually communicate that hurt? Or is the onus on the person who did the hurting, and they should have more of a tolerance and a patience because they were the perceived offender? And as you may expect, the answer is both. The onus is on both. It takes two to tango. All communication relies on two people. It's never one person's fault. It always has two people. And so what's interesting about this is that for the person who feels wronged, when the other person now is upset because you yelled at them, now they're playing the victim role, and you're even more upset because, again, the focus on what they did, and now they turned it around, it's about how you just treated them. So we hear, it's called selective hearing, right? We hear what we want to hear. This happens a lot, selective hearing, for a lot of reasons. I want you to think about something kind of unique on this topic. So on past shows, I've talked about love languages. And love languages are basically spit in the face of the concept of do unto others as you'd have done to you, because love languages say we can't motivate other people. We can't recognize or appreciate other people in the exact same way we would want to be recognized and appreciated. So love languages have identified 5 ways you can recognize and appreciate people, and know that you might choose to be recognized and appreciated in certain ways, but perhaps people in your lives don't want to be recognized and appreciated in those same ways. Now, there's also languages of apology. Languages of apology are when someone wrongs you, how you would like to be apologized to, and what you could actually hear. And why languages of apology are so critical, because if you do something wrong to me, depending on the severity of it, and your response is, oh, I'm sorry for doing that, well, in your mind, that could be the most authentic or genuine sorry you've ever given in your life. But in my mind, I didn't hear it that way. Because as I was listening to you apologize, my rule of apology is that when someone apologizes to me, especially if it's for something somewhat significant, I want them also to tell me their plan to make sure it doesn't happen again. Now, I want you to think about this in very simple terms for a moment. Okay, great, because we're talking about listening, being able to listen and process another person's apology, especially in conflict. So think about, for those of you out there who have kids, think about when you ask your kids to do something repeatedly, like clean your room. And so you say, hey, Johnny, you need to clean your room. Oh, sorry, Mom. Sorry, Dad. Yeah, I know. And you're like, okay, well, they said sorry, so they do seem somewhat regretful. A week later, room's still messy. Hey, didn't we talk about this? You said you were cleaning your room. Oh, I know. I'm sorry. Yeah, I did. Sorry about that. And this could go on for weeks and months, right? I just had a situation with an organization I'm working with right now, very similar professional situation. Forget the child doing their chores. This is a situation where a manager needed an employee to fill out a time card. And they've told the employee several times. The employee still doesn't fill out the time card. Still do it. So the manager emailed me and said, Mark, what should I do? I've asked several times. The manager blows it off. And now the manager's boss said, just let it be and just sign off on whatever their time card is, whether it's incomplete or not. So their boss basically told them to enable the behavior. But that's not where we're going to go here. But think about that. So here's the point of the story, right? Sorry. You've asked someone repeatedly not to do something. Second, third, fourth, fifth time, and they're still just saying sorry. So what I would say to my son, and I genuinely say this, is if I ask for something 2 or 3 times and it's still not done, when they say, oh, sorry about that, I said, well, I understand you may be sorry, but what are you going to do to make sure this doesn't happen again so you don't have to continue to have this conversation? So I want an action plan. I want some thought put into preventing them happening again. Because there's an implication when someone says sorry, that if they are genuinely sorry, that there's going to be a commitment for the action or behavior or habit not to repeat itself. And without that action plan, or without that commitment, there's a pretty good chance the action and behavior may repeat itself. So what this comes down to when you talk about apology languages and what you want to hear for someone to show you and tell you that they're sorry, it's very different. Some people want to hear some very significant degree of remorse communicated. My method is I want to hear the actions support the words. So you have love languages, you have languages of apology, and then you have something I've created called anger languages. So I think about when you have someone in your life, could be a partner, could be a family member, could be a close friend, could be a boss, could be a coworker, and you know you're going to get frustrated with another. And by the way, anger isn't always bad. Anger, if it helps contribute and elicit change, is good. Emotion's good. I'd rather have people show some emotion than be indifferent. But you know when you get angry with someone, you have an anger language. That anger language might be you may become sarcastic. You may leave the conversation and walk away because you don't want to deal with that person. You may say that the other person's overreacting and start minimizing what they say. You may yell, you may insult, you may criticize, you may become passive-aggressive. But that's just it. You may have an anger language that you default to in certain relationships, in certain situations, but what does that do to the other person when they hear that and they're listening to your anger language? Does it distract from the pain? Does it distract from the root cause of why you're upset? And if it does, that's a problem. So the question is it worth having a conversation to say to someone, hey, when I get angry, this is what I typically do. Have some self-awareness and emotional intelligence. And then let the other person tell you how that makes them feel when you do that. And try to come to some kind of compromise or resolution. So when we come back for our final segment, I'll tell you exactly how to have that conversation. And we're going to finish by talking also about way to motivate people in sports and in sales. For ICommunicate, I'm Mark Altman. We'll be back after the break. Okay, welcome back to our segment. This is Mark Altman for ICommunicate. Glad you're with us. If you'd like to talk with me about training or speaking opportunities for your company around communication, leadership, change management, emotional intelligence, conflict, please reach out 982061535 and info@mindsetgo.com. We'd love to talk to you. In the meantime, I told you I'd tell you how to have that conversation about anger languages. So the way you have the conversation is, if you tend to be the kind of person who's sarcastic or perhaps may become passive-aggressive when someone triggers you or makes you angry, and you know that's not going to go well for your partner because they're not going to receive that well, and they're not really going to be able to focus or listen, process why you're actually angry, then what you do is you create an accountability partner situation. So I would say to my current partner, I would say, listen, if you really get upset when I become sarcastic or passive-aggressive, then please remind me that I'm doing it in a gentle way. And so I would have my partner say, listen, I'm happy to hear why I'm upset, and I want to know why you're upset. I just would ask you to not be sarcastic because you know how that makes me feel. A lot of people, when I tell them that, say, well, that might not be great in that moment because people are angry. But what it actually does is there's really no downside, right? Either the person ignores what you said or it creates a shift in mindset by making you pause and what your end goal is in communicating hurt, disappointment, or frustration. So by your accountability partner saying, listen, I'm happy to hear what you have to say. I want to know why you're upset, but please just don't communicate it that way. That gives you a chance to pause, reframe, and restructure how you want to talk about it. And it also shows an empathy that you really value the other person involved in this relationship. Now, I don't expect this to be executed 100% of the time, but I'll tell you what, if you had the ability to discuss this anger language concept without being heat of battle in a very calm moment, and even if it worked 1 out of every 3 or 4 times, then that's going to save you a lot of stress and heartache and put a lot of more emphasis on the relationship itself, the individual issue that is creating the problem. So, that's a little bit about anger languages, love languages, and languages of apology. They're fascinating to improve communication in the professional realm, in personal realm, relationships between parents and kids, so much. Now let's talk about sports for a moment. This is one of my passions. I've been coaching sports for about 20 years. I'm a big sports fan. I love sports. And so the reason why I use this in sports is because I was talking to my son the other day who's going into 8th grade. And sometimes when I see him play basketball, if one of his teammates doesn't do what they're supposed to do during a game, they're not in position to defend the opponent properly, they're not in position to rebound, they take a bad shot, my son in the past might turn around and say something like, well, why'd you do that? Or don't you know you're supposed to guard the guy? Or you're supposed to guard the guy, or the woman for that matter. And so what I told him is, do you think that if someone makes a mistake and you yell over to that person, you're supposed to cover that guy? Do you think, A, that's going to motivate them to do anything different? And do you think, B, that's going to make them feel better about themselves? Because most people, when they don't do something right, deep down they know they didn't do it right. And they're probably, in some cases, and in many cases, giving themselves a hard time. So the benefit of making that person feel bad in that moment by making a statement with a negative tone or negative word choice, probably not get it done. I often talk to baseball coaches, especially at like the Little and Babe Ruth level, when a shortstop misses a ball or an infielder misses a ball, what do we typically yell to the infielder? Hey, you got to get down on the ball. Well, they know they have to get down on the ball, but they're still not doing it. So they're not listening to you. They're tuning you out. And this is the kind of thing that gets people tuned out. I call this parent speak, teacher speak, coach speak, boss speak. When you say things to people and they start tuning you out, it's one of the biggest frustrations parents have when they stop figuring out how to effectively communicate with their kids because their kids know what's coming and they tune them out. So look, it's a very simple thing in sports. Instead of making a statement, ask a question. Instead of yelling, hey, you got to get down on the ball, or hey, you got to cover that guy in basketball, why not ask, hey, what do you think happened there? And let's say the kid says in baseball, well, it went through my legs. Well, why do you think that happened? Well, because I didn't get down on the ball. Why do you think that is? Why are you struggling to still get down on the ball? I don't know. But right there, that's the key. Because if the person doesn't know what habit, what behavior, what item they need to practice to get better at getting down on the ball, or to get better at guarding your man consistently and knowing where you're supposed to be on the floor, they don't know that, then they're tuning you out and they can't even hear you and they're not listening to you because they've heard it all before. Listening, when you're trying to get someone to listen to you, you've got to get to the root cause of the habit or the behavior or the emotional challenges experiencing that they need help with to form the habit and to create the repetition. So when we talk about having a listening mindset, if you're a coach and you're calling people over in a huddle, you could say all you want. But if it sounds like something they've heard before, they're likely to tune it out, and you're much better off asking questions to understand why something's not happening and making a statement and alerting them that it isn't happening. Now, I'm going to give you the last example to finish the show, and that relates to sales. Now, what's interesting about sales and how listening often plays out in sales is a lot of times when a salesperson is talking to a prospect for the first time, the prospect may have an attitude, I call this listening to be convinced. So the prospect is skeptical. Why? Because they've dealt with salespeople in the past. They think they know what's coming. They think they know how the salesperson is going to frame the value and benefits of what they're selling. And they don't want to be tricked They want to be able to trust the person. So they actually have a mindset of listening to be convinced. And the problem is when people are listening to be convinced, then they're not completely listening. They're half listening, right? And I'll give you a perfect example of how listening can get distracted in the sales process. Let's say you're selling something to someone, a service or a product. And 5 minutes into the presentation, they're like, hey, can you tell me how much this costs? Can we just get to that? Well, you can duck the question. You can tell people you'll get to it in 10 minutes or 15 minutes. But if you don't make them feel better about their concern about cost, they're going to be distracted during the entire presentation. Because the more you talk about all these great features and benefits of your product, the more you talk about the bells and whistles of how they address the prospect's pain centers, the more you do that, you know what they're thinking as you say that? They're half listening because they're saying to themselves, yeah, sounds good. I just wonder how much this is all going to cost in the end. So when people are listening to be convinced, or listening with doubt, or listening with specific concern, right? You have to address it. You can't delay it. You can't run from it. Those are important aspects of listening. So in the sales process, what I would say is if someone was concerned about money, instead of trying to duck the question, I would validate the question. I would say, I can totally understand your concern about cost. Do you have a budget established that you know what you can spend? What are you currently paying for your current product or service? What did you anticipate paying? I don't want to run from questions. I want to deal with it head on so they can remove the distraction. We can give them a peace of mind. I can still come back to it later, but I do want to deal with that. At minimum, may give them a range of minimum to maximum, so they at least have some peace of mind and feel like they were heard and validated what their concern was. So we're going to continue this conversation next week. We're going to talk about what gets in the way of listening. What are some things you can do to overcome those challenges, not only for yourself, but the people that you're hoping get listened to. And one of the last comments I'll make from the show is, when you think about public speaking could be a one-on-one conversation. If you're in the business of needing to be listened to, if you're in the business of having to influence and motivate others, please join us again for part 2, because we're going to talk about how you can more effectively do just that. For ICommunicate, thanks for joining us today. Ted, thank you for all your hard work. I'm Mark Altman. We'll see you next time.